This week's episode of Two Truths and a Lie, which is also broadcast on LinkedIn as Alpha Thoughts from the beforealpha.com site. Today, I'm joined again by Greg Narain, who is my co-host on this show. And we're going to talk a little bit about Instagram, since it's a lot in the news, particularly today. But first, before we get too involved, I want to ask Gregarious to tell us his two truths and a lie about himself. And then at the end, he'll reveal which one was the lie. Hopefully, that'll get you all to stay on and watch. Shoot, Greg, your two truths and a lie.
Absolutely. So I have three things to tell you today. I have lived in 4 different states. I was a designer for many years before I was a developer. And I used to be a podcaster.
All right. So at the end, we'll find out which of those things are true or not true. The thing we want to talk to you today mostly about was Instagram, because it is probably the most talked about and seems to be the most popular platform for influencer marketing these days. More and more in the United States, certainly across the world, being used by more and more brands to reach their audiences. But we have some slightly differing opinions. Greg, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think, I've been looking at it and I, from my point of view, I think, brands should the whole follower count thing has been, I think, an unfortunate proxy for meaning, right? And, even when in the work we did like at Clout, a lot of people would argue like that, that you could take sort of the, follower count by the number of people they're following and sort of determine some heuristic that was valuable or interesting. I think like when I look at how brands are using the follower count, I think they're really focused on a quantity thing. And it's, again, that same remapping of their old expectations, right? Like, how do we bring the advertising world and bring it and map it into the universe that we've always been accustomed to and happy with? And I think now everyone realized they got to hike it out of the woods, and we've got to like figure out how to have quality relationships with people and how to like do the hard thing at scale, not the easy thing at scale.
And that actually brings us, and I agree 100%, and that actually brings us to our first truth, which is reach, which is what we've been using as sort of the result or how we compensate people. That was a subject of an article this morning in Digiday about how some of the platforms are changing their payment compensation because they've been paying influencers based on reach, and they're shifting more to engagement models and more to sort of results-oriented models. And that's, in fact, the first truth, is that reach is really a delivery metric. It's not a performance metric. So in order to understand how things are performing and how well any influencer does, but particularly Instagram, we need to look at the engagement with the content, not just how many followers they have. And actually, that's true whether the followers are real followers or fake followers, because we talked about, you mentioned this last week. It doesn't matter if they're fake. What matters is how many engage with the content. And yes, we want to make sure that people aren't buying followers, but we can't really hold the influencers responsible for knowing that someone who followed them is or isn't a bot, right? I mean, and that's one of the other sort of things that creeps into this, is that bots are starting to follow people. And unless you're paying a lot of attention, as I do and you do, but not everyone does, you don't always know it's not a real person that's trying to follow you.
Yeah, that's right. I really like your notion of focusing on performance. And if I was to argue that there was anything else that we might want to think about, my good friend Brian and I, Solis, always talk about this idea that there's, net promoter score is sort of like this thing that's been around, but, it's not necessarily the most important. It's a good metric, but like, what's the equivalent on social, right? Like, where does all of the other conversational, sort of side effects come into play, and how do we measure that, right? And I think it really speaks to like sort of the attribution problem that we still see, in social to a large degree. And I think as companies invest in more and more channels, it gets harder and harder to know, is this the thing that did it, or is that the thing that did it, right? Followers are also they're diverse, they're multi-represented, right? Like, so they may be one set of people on Twitter versus on Instagram, and then different people have those same people in other places.
And it's a problem. I think we're going to talk about it at some point in more detail, but who's working on things that get us past the last click and understanding attribution past just the last thing that somebody saw? Because unless you are, unless you're really looking at your whole channel and your whole flow of marketing, you're only paying attention to that last click. And at some point, the last click is always going to be your website or Amazon or someplace else. And that's not necessarily, not for nothing. I know we get a lot of information from Amazon, but that doesn't mean that we get all the information about the products and services that we buy from the place that we actually bought them at. And, metrics are complicated, by the way, particularly the way Facebook and Instagram are set up. If you have personal profiles on those platforms, you actually have relatively little in the way of metrics. And if you have to have a business profile in order to even have any kind of good metric for Instagram to give you. And so for the people that are building their Instagram programs or scraping Instagram, if they're working with influencers who have personal profiles, not business profiles on Instagram, the amount of data they can actually get is very limited. So, if I was going to give a piece of advice to our anyone who's working with Instagram influencers, is to make sure that they're actually converting their profile to a business profile, so you actually have access to any of those metrics. This is a personal bet noir for me, because most of my pages are actually personal profiles, and I've had them for years. And I'm now in this place where I have to make a decision: do I convert my Facebook over to a Facebook page, which I haven't done? Do I convert my Instagram over to a business profile? Because in order to have a business profile on Instagram, and this is where it all gets really confusing, you actually have to link it to a Facebook business page. So even if you don't need a Facebook business page, even if you don't want a Facebook business page, in order to have good metrics on Instagram, you have to have one.
Yeah, I think you also hit on another interesting point, or an important point of this conversation, is the professionalism of the influencer themselves, right? And a lot of brands, I think one of the sort of reasons they don't want to work directly with influencers often, and they prefer working through an MCN or someone else, is that they want to be buffeted from sort of maybe the inexperience, right? Or the disorganization that may exist at those other levels. And I think influencers would be wise, and by the way, it probably becomes a good filter over time of, is this a professional? Right, like it may actually increasingly or decrease the odds that they've sort of stirred the pot a bit to get their follower counts up, in an inorganic way. But of course, we can't stop the robots and the bots and all the other weird things that do happen as well.
No, in fact, that's sort of getting back to Instagram, or any single platform isn't the only platform. And sort of when I look at this, looking at the scale of reach isn't necessarily the be all and end all. Working with fewer people, but actually working with them on a more consistent basis, or working with them in a deeper way. If you actually know someone, you have a pretty good idea about whether and how many of those followers are real or not real. And when you sort of start always looking for the biggest number, and I love Instagram. I think it's a great platform. I think it's got a lot of opportunity for brands. And more so every day as they continue to morph the platform to be a more brand-friendly environment, to be able to track things better, to understand what's happening. But it's not the only platform. And the other interesting piece of news that hit today was eMarketer released its sort of big roundup on the global influencer market. And while Instagram was one of the top platforms, it certainly wasn't the only platform. In Germany, for example, YouTube is neck and neck with Instagram in terms of brand use. And when you step into the Far East in particular, even chat apps and things like WhatsApp and Messenger apps are actually more used by both consumers, and largely maybe a better place for us to engage with influencers. So it's, that's a global perspective, but it also hangs true even within the United States. Just because Instagram is a popular platform and it's a great platform for certain kinds of content and certain kinds of brands, doesn't mean it's the right place for every influencer. And that's the other truth is, when you're thinking about your platform should always follow your purpose, not the other way around. You shouldn't sit here. I remember in the very early days, people would say, we need to have a Twitter strategy. And I was like, well, no, you actually don't need a Twitter strategy. You need a strategy for understanding whether or not you should use Twitter. And I think the same is true for any of these platforms. It's not to be on the platform. Is that the right platform?
Yeah, we developed this thing at Shoot years ago called the Content Marketing Aperture, and it was sort of these 8 ways to sort of frame conversation. I'll put a link for you guys later. But one of the most important things that I sort of always tell people is that it's not platforms; they're people on the other side of that. And when it comes to any kind of information or content, different people have different appetites, right? And so some consumers or some customers want to prefer information, say audio, video, photos, whatever it may be. You have to understand that first and foremost, but then each of those platforms as they are, right, have their own sensibilities, right? You can't bring your corporate shtick and shove it into Tumblr, right? No one gets that. What they want,
Tumblr,
right?
what's Tumblr?
Yeah, exactly, right. But each of these things has their own sort of their mentality sort of baked into that platform. And so the real important part, and why I think brands suffer a lot in this domain, is translating themselves into those mediums, right, in a way that is native and sort of authentic to that platform, as well as to themselves, right? And too often the company is, doesn't want to own or doesn't feel like what it is per se. They sort of react to what they need to do, as opposed to sort of espousing more of themselves.
That's actually a really good point about developing a task or the storytelling opportunities that are optimized for the platform. You don't want to just do an Instagram story. You want to use it effectively and you tell your story in the right way within that format, because otherwise it's just like, the Cinderella stepsister shoving their feet into the tiny slipper, right?
Yeah.
You have to make sure that not only are you doing due diligence about the influencers that you want to work with, do they have the right audiences? Do they have audiences that are engaging with them? I say this all the time. I could call myself a beauty influencer because I like to talk about beauty. I mean, actually, that's not true. But if people don't engage with you about the content, about the topic, you actually don't have influence on that topic because you're not getting the engagement. So looking at whether people are actually having that conversation and then creating an opportunity to tell the story of your brand within the context of that opportunity. It's not just to be on Instagram or be in a story. How do you tell a good story within an Instagram story?
That's right. And there's just, everyone seems to think that, they're all the same because they're just copying each other and becoming the same thing, or convert. Like if Snapchat does it, then, you remember when there was a time when stories was everything and suddenly everybody had stories, right? But it was just very different, right? And the difference is actually not necessarily the toolkit, it's the people, right? The people you've accumulated with and convene with on Facebook is just different than your LinkedIn community is different than your Snapchat community is different than, your Instagram community. And so even though these might be the same people, they have different expectations in those domains.
And there's always the example of breaking apart by age, right? I've seen numerous research that shows, and I think this is very, very true, that Snapchat is obviously going to skews much younger and Instagram skews a little older. So even though they may have the same kinds of tools and tool sets, if you're trying to reach 18-year-olds, you may want to look at Snapchat versus Instagram just because of the population that's on the platform. The same is true of video, right? I mean, if you're trying to reach gamers, you probably are looking at Twitch, not YouTube, just because there's different audiences within those platforms, even though they may do many of the same kinds of things. And so brands really need to be thinking about not just first their purpose, what are they trying to achieve, then their platform, where is it the best place to tell the story, and then the last thing we think about is who's going to help us tell it. Because if you start with the influencer and say, I really love that person, I want to work with that person, that's actually not going to achieve a good marketing objective versus taking it down the right process. So anything else on those two truths that we had that you wanted to share, Greg?
No, I think that's a pretty good overview of some of the challenges there.
Okay, so my myth for you all today is that organic, in quotes, social content is better than influencer marketing because the person sharing it wasn't compensated for his or her work. And this is a myth that I would love to kill dead, because the idea that it has to truly come from the heart, and we wouldn't have all this fraud and problems if we just got people to share things authentically, because the truth is there are very, very few brands that can incite that kind of authentic, spontaneous sharing. I mean, I can think of four, right? And there may be Apple, Harley Davidson, maybe Star Wars, maybe Marvel. And those are my four of the day. Apple's always on my list. Can incite that kind of spontaneous sharing when they have news to share, because they've built a good fan base already. They made that investment in their fan base and their community. But for the rest of us, we really need to prime the pump a little bit with something, because, organic is just as likely to be, organic material, if you get my drift, and a negative comment as it is to be positive. So, get over the idea that you shouldn't be compensating. Just let's make sure we compensate people correctly.
I think that's absolutely right. And I would add to that a lot of people, brands also just have their own expectations around quality, of the content itself. And, you just don't always get that if you don't work with the people who might basically do this for a living. And guess what? Now they're professionals or they're prosumers or whatever it may be, that it's their job. Right. And it's not to say that they're selling their opinion or swaying their opinion per se. Right. It's just that this is what they do for work now. Right. Yeah.
Start with people who are passionate about your brand, but compensate them for the work they do. Mine your social feeds for those organic mentions that they may happen once in a while. I mean, you can't count on
good directionality.
You can't
good directionality, right? Like if it's happening, like more and more organic is happening, that's a great signal potentially, right? But could also be for the wrong reason. So it's important to know why, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And lastly, whether it's organic content that you see that, again, may happen spontaneously, just not with any regularity or not with any ability to count on it. As Greg said, you got to be able to, if you're waiting for someone to say something nice, you can't count on that. But when it does happen, that could be someone that would be a good person to work with. And then, don't be afraid to boost your best performing content. Take the stuff that does work well, invest in some stuff that does work well, and then do a lot more with it. Put it in your ads, put it in your website, put it everywhere. And that's true on Instagram. You can use that Instagram content elsewhere. So those are our two truths and a myth for this week. Finally, I just wanted to give a word of personal caution, because the other thing that's been happening on Instagram that we've noticed a lot is people dying for that great photo, whether it's getting bitten by a shark or falling off a building or, falling down a waterfall. And, you don't want, nor do you want the influencers working with you to become the Darwin Award winners in the Instagram category. Yeah. So we need to make sure that we don't ask people to do things, or ourselves, when we're trying to build our audiences, do things that are just plain stupid. You matter more than a like or a share.
Yeah, I don't know if you just saw the article I just posted actually about the kids jumping out of their moving car now. It's a new meme. Yeah, I'll provide a link for that down below too. It's kind of ridiculous, but yeah, it's just content, right?
Exactly. So, Greg, what's your lie? What it wasn't true in the beginning of this?
So I have not lived in 4 states. I have actually lived in 3. Born and raised in New York. Grew up in, spent some time in New Jersey, but basically like still living in or working in the city. And now I live in California.
Right coast to the left coast.
That's right. Now I figure out where to go next.
Thank you all for either watching live or watching this later on its tape delay. We will see you next week at around the same time, same channel.
Or maybe in person, actually, next week.
Yes, we will be in person next week, so we'll have to figure out how to use this tool from an in-person way. Have a great week and a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
All right, bye, everyone.